Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the On Centerline podcast. I am your host, Sam Terrell, the Northwest Aeronaut on YouTube. Thank you for joining me. Today, we're going to be continuing our discussion on the Commercial Pilot ACS or Commercial Pilot Check Ride Prep. This is not going to be a new section of the ACS. We're going to kind of keep chipping away at the pilot privileges and limitations we talked about last week, specifically in regards to just the difference between common versus private carriage. All right. So we're going to dive right into it. And for this, we're going to be referring to an advisory circular AC 120-12A alpha. So this is a very common and popular advisory circular, probably because the topic it addresses is so vague and general, and the FAA doesn't really like giving too much information. You know, if the FAA gives too many black and white rules, it makes it easier, I guess, for people to find ways around those rules. So the FAA keeps it very vague as far as what you can and can't do as a commercial pilot, with very vague language, open-ended language, and it allows them to try to keep everybody in one bucket. And, you know, if you say, oh, well, I did it this way, gives them a little bit of flexibility to come back and say, yeah, well, that's why it's written this way, because we don't want you doing that. So unfortunately, that's just the way it is. But we're going to get into AC 120-12A, and we're going to start with the background behind this advisory circular. So the background, it states, common carriage and private carriage are common law terms. So that's one thing you have to understand, is that these terms do not come from the FAA. They are common law terms, and it says that the Federal Aviation Act of 1958 uses the term common carriage, but does not define it. It has therefore been determined that guidelines giving general explanations of the term common carriage and its opposite, private carriage, would be helpful. In other words, the FAA tried to remain as vague as possible, and a bunch of people over the years have complained and asked for clarification, so they say, okay, fine. We will try to give you a little bit of guidance, a little bit of explanation, because I guess it might be a little helpful. Well, yeah, it'd be a lot helpful, I think. Anyway, let's go in and get into here, and we're going to read the guidelines. It says, a carrier becomes a common carrier when it holds itself out. And for those of you who don't know, the term holding out is basically just a fancy term for advertising. Okay, you become a common carrier when you advertise to the public your services. Okay, so it says holds itself out to the public or to a segment of the public as willing to furnish transportation within the limits of its facilities to any person who wants it. Again, a bunch of vague terms. I mean, I don't know. Anyway, let's keep going here. Let's see here. We're going to go ahead and skip ahead a little bit. It says there are 4 elements in defining a common carrier. And this is important here, guys. The 4 elements are: 1, a holding out of a willingness to; 2, transport persons or property; 3, from place to place; 4, for compensation. So in other words, in order to be classified as a common carrier, you need to do all 4 of these things, which they put into one long sentence. And the sentence would just read like this: a holding out of a willingness to transport persons or property from place to place for compensation. If there is even one of those things that you are not doing, you are not considered a common carrier. All right? Now, it says this holding out, in quotation marks, which makes a person a common carrier, can be done in many ways, and it does not matter how it is done. And that's more of that open-ended, open language, right? They're not putting a strict definition on it, because obviously, you know, this makes sense. There's a lot of ways people could advertise their services and get around a strict rule that says, hey, advertising means you put up a sign in a window somewhere. Well, yeah, they're not going to be that strict about the possibilities, because it's not only about the current possibilities that are out there for advertising, but the future possibilities, right? As we become more and more electronically engaged with social media and all that, they got to leave some open-ended language there for future ways of advertising. So that makes sense, but it does go on to say, signs and advertising are the most direct means of holding out, but are not the only ones. All right, so let's keep going here. It goes on to state later on, a few paragraphs down, that carriage for hire, which does not involve holding out, is private carriage. So in other words, according to this, and again, I'm going to put the disclaimer out there that you should not be taking anything I'm saying here at face value or as fact. All right. There's too much gray area in all of these regulations and definitions and interpretations from the FAA for me to give you a straight answer, because I don't even have the straight answers. So don't take this as fact. Okay. I am not putting this out here as being just the correct answer. So don't blame me if you make a decision that gets you in trouble with the FAA. But here in this advisory circular, it says carriage for hire, which does not involve holding out, is private carriage. Therefore, if you do carriage for hire, but you don't advertise it, that is private carriage. You are not a common carrier. Private carriers for hire are sometimes called contract carriers, but the term is borrowed from the Interstate Commerce Act and legally inaccurate when used in connection with the Federal Aviation Act. Thanks for telling us that it basically doesn't mean anything in regards to aviation. That's what I'm getting from that. It goes on to say private carriage for hire is carriage for one or several selected customers, generally on a long-term basis. The number of contracts must not be too great, otherwise it implies a willingness to make a contract with anybody. A carrier operating pursuant to 18 to 24 contracts has been held to be a common carrier because it held itself out to serve the public generally to the extent of its facilities. Again, whatever that means. Next sentence goes on to say private carriage has been found in which cases where 3 contracts have been the sole basis of the operator's business. So basically, 18 to 24, you're common carriage. 3 or less, you're private. What happens between 4 and 17? Your guess is as good as mine. All right. Let's keep going here. Paragraph H here states that persons admittedly operating as common carriers in a certain field, for instance, in intrastate commerce, sometimes claim that transportation for hire which they perform in other fields, for instance, interstate or foreign commerce, again, lots of terms and very convoluted here, but they say that these common carriers talk about certain operations being classified as private carriage. Now, it goes on to say, to sustain such a claim, the carrier must show that the private carriage is clearly distinguishable from its common carriage business and outside the scope of its holding out. So in other words, if you're going to make a claim that what you're doing is private carriage, you better be prepared to sit down with the FAA and prove to them that, hey, I'm not holding out for this service. This is a strictly, private endeavor, business, single contract, whatever. And that's basically what I tell all my students. If you're going to engage in anything like that, you better be able to prove that you are not willing to do it for everybody, that you're not holding out for it, that it is strictly a private contract, and be able to justify your decision. So you can either do it that way and ask for forgiveness after the fact, or better yet, again, if you have any questions about the validity of a certain job opportunity, talk to the local FSDO ahead of time, whatever they say, but especially if they respond in the affirmative. In other words, they say it's okay. get that answer in writing from them. All right. When it comes to the FAA, it is not always better to ask for forgiveness after the fact. We want to ask for permission first if you have any question. In summary, it goes on to say that persons intending to conduct only private operations in support of other business should look cautiously at any proposal for revenue-generating flights, which most likely would require certification as an air carrier. All right. And it does say persons who have questions concerning intended operation of their aircraft are encouraged to discuss their proposed operation with the regional council of the FAA region in which it intends to establish its principal business office. In other words, talk to the FSDO, okay? Now, while it does encourage that, it does not guarantee a response or easy communication. So that'll about do it, folks. Again, common carriage must have those 4 things, okay? A holding out of a willingness to transport persons or property from place to place for compensation. That is a common carrier. Private carrier would be someone who doesn't do that, okay? But even as a private carrier, you are limited in the number of contracts that you might be able to justify without crossing over into that common carrier realm. Hey, I hope you found this helpful. And if you have, please share it with someone else that you think would find it helpful. Don't forget to hit that like button and that subscribe button if you're here on YouTube. Hit that follow button if you're out there in podcast land. I really appreciate you spending time with me today, and we will see you next time on Centerline.